Welcome to the debate. Right now, thousands of Americans are stranded in the Middle East following the administration's preemptive military strikes on Iran. We are looking at the core friction emerging from this crisis.
Right, and it's a massive point of contention. We're asking, was the rapid initiation of this military action a necessary preemptive strike against an imminent threat, one that unfortunately precluded a standard civilian evacuation?
Exactly. Or on the other hand, does the lack of a pre-strike evacuation plan demonstrate a fundamental failure of strategic priorities and crisis management from the administration? This discussion stems directly from recent public statements and press briefings. We're specifically focusing on the remarks of Donald Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the strategic critiques raised by lawmakers like Senator Ruben Gallego.
Right, and for this discussion, I will be arguing that launching a military action without first securing the evacuation of civilians represents a profound failure of basic crisis planning and leadership.
And I'll be arguing the opposing view, that the strikes were a necessary, fast-moving, preemptive action against an imminent threat, making a protracted prior evacuation simply impossible.
Well, I look at this sequence of events and see something entirely different from a necessary trade-off. Launching a massive military action without first securing the evacuation of your own civilians isn't just an unfortunate byproduct of war. It represents a profound failure of basic crisis planning.
I mean, if we look at the operational environment the administration was facing, the clock was really the primary enemy here. The reality of statecraft and military strategy is that you don't always get to dictate the timeline of your actions. We were looking at a rapidly escalating imminent threat. You can see this in the specific rationale articulated by Donald Trump in the recent briefings. The intelligence indicated that adversaries were, quote, getting ready to attack Israel and other allied nations in the region.
But the administration has also stated that these were stationary missiles that had been aimed at these countries for a long period of time.
Yes, they were.
So if they were stationary and aimed for a long period, that implies a known baseline threat level. It completely contradicts the idea that this was a sudden, unforeseen emergency that completely bypassed the possibility of basic logistical preparation.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how intelligence evolves. A missile can be stationary and aimed for months as a deterrent. But when the intelligence suddenly shifts from they're aimed to they are fueling and getting ready to attack, the timeline compresses from months to minutes. Under those specific parameters, Trump's assertion that we attacked first is a fundamentally justified defense of preemptive action. When a credible, imminent strike is poised to devastate Allied infrastructure and civilian populations, neutralizing that threat becomes the overriding directive.
I come at it from a different way. No one is arguing that neutralizing a genuine, imminent threat isn't a priority. But the sequence of events we are witnessing does not merely reflect a tragic trade-off for regional security. We are watching a scenario where thousands of Americans are trapped in an active conflict zone directly because of a timeline dictated by their own government. You do not decouple military action from civilian protection. They are two sides of the same strategic coin.
Look, no one is happy that American civilians are stranded, and nobody is celebrating that fact. It is deeply unfortunate, but we have to talk about what civilian protection actually looks like in practice. Bypassing the standard, slow-moving evacuation protocols was not a dismissal of American lives. It was a tragic but necessary trade-off to prevent a catastrophic regional attack. Trump accurately noted that it happens all very quickly.
But that timeline argument falls apart when you look at the State Department's current scramble. Let's look at the glaring contradiction in the leadership right now. You have Donald Trump, who launched these strikes, immediately deflecting fundamental logistical questions about evacuation to his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio.
Which is standard procedure.
But when we look at Rubio's responses to the press, he openly admits that they are only, quote, trying to carry out and formulate the evacuation plan right now.
I'd argue the delegation of logistical operations to the State Department is exactly how the executive branch is supposed to function during a crisis. The president makes the overarching strategic call to neutralize an imminent threat, and the State Department manages the complex diplomatic and logistical fallout.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Delegation is normal, yes. but scrambling to build the foundational framework of an evacuation days after hostilities have commenced is not normal. It has now been 3, 4, perhaps 5 days since the bombs started dropping. If we look specifically at Secretary Rubio's statements admitting they are trying to put this together currently, the logical flaw there is inescapable. As Rubio's own words highlight, if you are doing it now, by definition, you did not do it before the attack. Standard protocol dictates that securing airspace, moving civilians, and preparing evacuation routes must happen before the military action begins.
Let's pause on the idea of standard protocol for a second, because we need to inject some technical reality into how these systems actually work. You don't just snap your fingers and 1,500 people vanish from a volatile region. You're talking about a non-combatant evacuation operation, or NEO. That involves coordinating commercial airlines, chartering massive flights, and securing diplomatic overflight clearances. Do you know what happens the moment the State Department starts filing flight plans for a dozen chartered 777s out of a hostile region?
It signals movement, certainly.
It does more than signal movement. It hits global radar tracking instantly. You cannot secretly move thousands of people. In the realm of preemptive warfare, operational security is paramount. The moment those flight plans are filed, telegraphing your intentions, the adversary realizes a strike window is opening. The element of surprise is entirely eliminated, and eliminating that surprise means the adversary likely launches those stationary missiles immediately. You cannot pre-evacuate without signaling the strike.
That is a compelling argument regarding operational security, and I acknowledge the tension between stealth and evacuation. But there is a massive difference between actively launching planes to evacuate citizens and simply having the blueprint of a plan sitting on a desk ready to execute. Secretary Rubio wasn't just saying, "We delayed the execution of our plan to maintain surprise." He essentially said, "We are figuring this out right now."
Well, I would argue that in a highly dynamic theater, the blueprint is really only as good as the immediate realities on the ground.
But the immediate realities on the ground are precisely what basic planning is supposed to account for. This contradiction heavily implies that it wasn't a calculated trade-off to maintain operational surprise. It implies that starting the bombing sooner was simply viewed as more important, and it entirely smothered the effort to secure Americans. Or worse, it suggests that civilian evacuation wasn't even a primary consideration until the media began asking aggressive questions about it.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it quite differently. The priority was saving lives, specifically preventing the astronomical loss of life that would have occurred had those missiles launched at Israel. But let's transition to those immediate realities on the ground, because we have to look at the data Secretary Rubio provided to understand why this evacuation is currently so difficult.
By all means, let's look at the data.
The State Department is currently assisting a massive number of people. It's over 1,500, maybe closer to 1,600 Americans who are actively requesting assistance. The severe logistical hurdles they are facing are largely beyond the administration's immediate control. Rubio explicitly pointed out the issue of airspace closures. Countries are locking down their skies. Furthermore, there is actual infrastructure damage. The airport in Kuwait, for example, was hit.
And why was it hit?
It was hit as part of the cascading regional fallout. But my point is, you can have all the military transports and chartered planes in the world lined up on a tarmac ready to go. But if the airports have been attacked, or you lack permission to land because the airspace is closed, you cannot simply force flights into that theater. The administration is doing exactly what it can within an intensely constrained physical environment.
Those logistical hurdles you just listed are precisely the reason why you plan before the bombing starts. Airspace closures and retaliatory attacks on regional infrastructure, like the airport in Kuwait being hit, are entirely predictable consequences of starting a major bombing campaign in the Middle East.
Predictable in theory, yes, but you cannot predict the exact hour a specific runway will be cratered.
You don't need to predict the exact hour. You just need to know that when you launch a preemptive strike, the airspace will shut down. You know regional airports will become targets. To act as though these are unforeseen acts of nature hindering the State Department is intellectually inconsistent. You do not get to use the foreseeable, direct consequences of your own military action as an excuse for why you cannot rescue your citizens.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes a level of omnipotence that no government possesses. Yes, airspace closures are predictable, But the exact timing, scope, and specific infrastructure targets cannot be perfectly modeled in advance when you are dealing with a fast-moving reactive adversary.
It doesn't require omnipotence. It requires basic tracking of your citizens. The unpreparedness we are seeing is so severe that Secretary Rubio actually had to make a public plea to the media during a press briefing, asking them to help locate Americans who might need assistance when the government is relying on press broadcasts to figure out who needs evacuation in an active war zone. It demonstrates a systemic failure to track and secure citizens prior to initiating hostilities.
I fundamentally disagree that utilizing the media is a sign of systemic failure. In a chaotic, degraded communication environment, a public plea to the media is a utilization of every available channel to ensure no one falls through the cracks. It's a practical step, not an admission of defeat. But I think we need to elevate this discussion to the broader strategic justification of these strikes. We cannot analyze the evacuation logistics in a vacuum. We have to look at what necessitated this action in the first place.
I agree we need to look at the broader picture. What is the ultimate strategic goal here?
The strategic goal is confronting a regime that is actively destabilizing the globe. The Ayatollah's regime in Iran is widely recognized as an absolute disaster. If you believe in democracy, the rule of law, civil rights, and human rights, there is no defending the regime's actions. Neutralizing the threat posed by this regime, especially when their missiles were poised to strike our allies like Israel, had to take overarching precedence. The administration made the hard choice to prioritize global security and allied defense over a slow, methodical withdrawal.
I absolutely agree with the characterization of the regime. As Senator Rubén Gallego accurately pointed out in his recent critiques of the situation, of course, the Ayatollah is a disaster. If you believe in human rights and the rule of law, nobody is looking at that regime and saying they are great. But acknowledging the profound moral failings of an adversary does not automatically validate every military action taken against them.
It validates preemptive action when they are actively fueling missiles aimed at an ally.
It provides a rationale, yes. But we still have to ask the much harder, critical questions regarding American involvement and execution. Was this specific action genuinely in the United States right now? Is a haphazardly launched bombing campaign actually well-positioned to solve the foundational problem of the Ayatollah and his regime? Increasingly, the long-term strategic answer seems to be no.
I think it's premature to declare the long-term strategic answer is no when the immediate tactical objective, stopping an imminent missile barrage, was achieved.
But at what cost to our own foundational systems? Senator Gallego and others have raised the fundamental question of legality. Is this action legal? I know asking about the legal framework of military engagement seems almost quaint to some at this point in time, but it remains vital to how our republic operates. By rushing into this strike, the administration bypassed legal and congressional deliberation.
The legal and moral authority for a president to defend allies from an imminent documented attack is well established in executive military precedent.
Executive precedent does not grant a blank check to ignore the logistical safety of American citizens. They completely smothered the fundamental responsibility of protecting those civilians. This is why the timeline and the legality are linked. When you bypass the deliberate, methodical processes of government, like congressional oversight or interagency logistical planning, you end up with blind spots. Incompetence at the logistical level often reflects a lack of rigor at the strategic level.
I see why you emphasize the legal and strategic oversight, and they are important frameworks. However, the administration was looking at a ticking clock. If the United States had paused to engage in protracted congressional debates, or to slowly orchestrate the evacuation of thousands of citizens, thereby telegraphing our intentions to global radar, the attack we were trying to prevent would have occurred.
And I keep returning to the fact that you can maintain operational security without leaving your State Department entirely in the dark until the bombs drop.
The broader justification here is that in the incredibly complex theater of the Middle East, sometimes the only option available is the one that carries immense operational risk. The strikes were a fast-moving necessity. The speed required to successfully neutralize those stationary missiles simply outpaced the mechanical ability to execute a standard civilian evacuation, The administration absorbed that risk to prevent a wider regional war.
That brings us right back to the core of my perspective on this entire crisis. A military operation that is executed so rapidly that it leaves over 1,500 of its own citizens stranded in the resulting crossfire cannot be deemed a strategic success. Launching a bombing campaign before securing those civilian evacuation routes represents a fundamental lack of basic crisis planning. You cannot claim strategic mastery when your Secretary of State is pleading with the media for help identifying stranded citizens days after the operation began.
As we synthesize where our perspectives diverge today, I maintain that the administration was forced to operate against a rapidly closing window. They took decisive preemptive action against missiles aimed at our allies, an action that unfortunately but necessarily outpaced our logistical capacity to run a slow-moving civilian evacuation beforehand. The intelligence dictated the timeline, not a lack of planning.
And I remain thoroughly unconvinced by that excuse. Launching a preemptive bombing campaign without first securing the safety and evacuation of your own civilians is a display of fundamental incompetence. Leaving over 1,500 Americans stranded due to a demonstrable lack of basic crisis planning, where the State Department is openly building the plan during the conflict, represents a severe failure in leadership priorities.
Well, despite our deep disagreements on the justification of this timeline and the administration's planning, it is clear we do share some fundamental points of convergence. We both recognize that the logistical situation on the ground right now is incredibly dire, complicated by highly restricted airspaces and damaged infrastructure like the airport in Kuwait.
That is correct. The current logistical nightmare on the ground is undisputed, as are the brutal realities of the Ayatollah's regime. We both view that regime as entirely hostile to human rights and the rule of law.
Exactly. Our core continuing disagreement fundamentally rests on whether the immediacy of the threat against our allies truly justified the severe, foreseeable risk placed on thousands of American civilians.
It does. Analyzing this timeline and the contradictory statements from the Commander-in-Chief and the Secretary of State provides all of us with a crucial lens into the immense complexities of military decision-making and crisis management.
The overarching tension between maintaining operational security for a preemptive strike and ensuring civilian safety is one of the most difficult balances in modern statecraft. The long-term effectiveness of this specific preemptive strike, the broader regional fallout, and most importantly, the ultimate fate of the stranded Americans requiring assistance, remain critical areas for further observation.
It is a balance that requires continuous scrutiny, especially when the lives of American citizens are hanging in the balance.
There is certainly far more to explore in this material as the situation on the ground continues to develop. We will leave it to you to weigh the evidence, the timelines, and the strategic arguments presented today, and to form your own conclusion on the administration's actions. Thank you for joining us for this rigorous exchange of ideas.